Good evening, and welcome to the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola. Welcome to those who join us here in the church and the others who join us via live stream. I am Father Michael Hilbert, Associate Pastor. And welcome to the second in our 2022 lecture series. This lecture series celebrates the Ignatian Year, the 5th centenary of St. Ignatius's cannonball moment, which we have depicted here in our sanctuary, and the 4th centenary of the canonization of St. Ignatius and St. Francis Xavier, among others. And we will celebrate that in about 10 days. The theme for the Ignatian Year and the lecture series is to see all things new in Christ. We have invited 5 distinguished Jesuits. The phrase distinguished Jesuit is not redundant, despite what you may have been told by Jesuits. But before I introduce the speaker, allow me to offer some practical information for those who join us, especially via live stream. You have online the outline of the lecture. It's provided digitally on your screens. And for those who are here present in the church, you have been given a printed copy of the outline, as well as an index card and a pencil. At the end of the talk, there will be time for questions. Please write your questions on the index card you have received and pass it to the center aisle, and the hospitality ministers will collect them and bring them to Father Haight. And tonight we are pleased and honored to have Father Roger Haight, a truly distinguished Jesuit theologian. Father Haight is a native of New Jersey. He studied theology first in the Philippines, then at Woodstock College in Maryland, and he received his master's and PhD in theology from the University of Chicago. Father has taught at the Ateneo de Manila, the Jesuit School of Theology in Chicago, Regis College in Toronto, the Weston School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He has also served as a visiting professor in Lima, Peru, Paris, Nairobi, and Pune in India. He is currently visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York, where he convenes the theology and ethics field and teaches systematic theology. Father Haight's topic this evening is the birth of American Catholic theology. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s was a watershed moment for Catholic theology around the world. Certainly the most important ecclesial event of the 20th century, and I dare say of the 21st. How the Church in America received these conciliar teachings and developed them in its own particular context is of great interest, especially now. Not just as history, but as direction for the future. Roger, we eagerly await your message.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I will ask us just for a minute, 5-10 seconds, to recall the world situation. I want to join us spiritually with the people of Ukraine. All right, let's begin. I'm very pleased to be with you this evening. Thank you to Fathers Hilbert and Yesalonia for this invitation. And thank you yourselves for coming out on a cold, still winter's night, and for those who are tuning in live stream. So I want to speak for about 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll have a little question and answer period. The title of the talk presupposes that specifically American Catholic theology, that a specifically American Catholic theology did not exist before the Second Vatican Council, and today it does. I want to do two things tonight. One is to show that that theology exists, and secondly, I want to describe its qualities or its characteristics and define it as distinctively American. Avery Dulles loosely described an American Catholic theology during the 1970s thus. He said, "It would be a theology generated in America, attentive to American culture, and recognized by others outside our context and recognized as being characteristic of it, important, and also distinctive." And valuable. Of course, it would be valuable. That idea remains very abstract, and I could refer to, it could refer to a book, it could refer to a collection of a subgroup of theologians, or it could refer to the whole. But to be American, it would reflect the culture of the United States. It would have an ecumenical dimension because of the role of Protestants in America. It would be democratic, since individual freedom is a strong cultural trait, and pluralistic because of the range of the social identities that make up our country. This remains vague, and distinction would appear, it seems to me, in contrast with other national or regional theologies and with its own past. To describe American theology and how it came to be, I will tell the story of how it arose. Therein lies the best and most thorough way of understanding it. To tell that story, I appeal to two sources of evidence, or to data. The first is the body of theology produced by the journal Theological Studies, which was founded by the Jesuits in 1940. It has produced over 320 issues during a period of 80 years. The second is the journal called The Proceedings of the Catholic Theological Society of America. This journal was published yearly, has been published yearly since 1946, and contains the discussions of the Professional Society of Theologians yearly. This journal, I have traced the development of Catholic theology in these two resources as a kind of record of how Catholic theology developed, initially was born and then developed afterwards. Telling this story is itself a problem, though, because it's a long and complex one. It forms part of a bigger and fascinating story of how Catholicism itself developed in America. It is also somewhat academic and technical, but I compress the story by making generalized statements, basically, and giving examples of them. First, I divide this period, this story or history, into three periods, roughly before, during, and after the Second Vatican Council. This gives us a simple chronological map of the birth of Catholic theology. Then, second, I focus on three indicators of how this birth took place. In each period, before, during, and after, I examine first the defining characteristics of theology at that time, how it dealt with change and time and the passage of development in the second point, and then thirdly, how it related to the world outside the church. What was that relationship? These three categories will give points of comparison between the three stages of development. So that's the plan. I invite you to imagine the Catholic Church in these three periods of time, before, during, and after the Second Vatican Council, and in each period, ask yourself how theology operated and how it presented its teachings to the Catholic public and beyond. So the first period, 1940 to 1965, the shadow of modernism. I pick up the story of American Catholic theology in 1940 from the first issue of Theological Studies. The first period stretches from to 1965 before the effects of the Second Vatican Council began to be reflected in theology and theological writing. I characterize this period as being in the shadow of modernism. In the Catholic Church, modernism with a capital M signifies heresy, one condemned in 1907 when certain philosophers, scripture scholars, and theologians tried to adjust Catholic teaching to the philosophy, theology, and history of the 19th and early 20th centuries. This was treated as an attack on traditional theology, like a disease within the church, so that the church took disciplinary measures which were set up in each of the dioceses in Europe and the United States to find the infected and to remove them from their teaching positions. In France, modernizing tendencies reappeared in the 1930s and early 1940s. And in 1950, another papal encyclical condemned what was called the New Theology, ideas that were associated with evolution. Theology in America was European and Roman, and mostly associated with seminaries. There was a male clerical discipline. Catholic colleges specialized in philosophy and advanced catechetics. There was only a few doctoral programs in the United States, and they were housed in seminaries with the exception of Catholic University of America. Jesuits teaching advanced theology got their doctorates from Rome or other European universities. So how was this discipline of theology to be described? First, the nature of theology. Theology, the word, designates or refers to the academic discipline that studies reality through the ideas and doctrines of the Christian faith. What do the principles of Christian faith say about the world as a created world, and about God, the Creator? Who is Jesus Christ? Where is history and personal human life headed? The way to understand the nature of such a discipline turns to the method of how theologians address these questions and produce their theology. The predominant method in Catholic theology prior to the Second Vatican Council was to explain church doctrine. Authority governed its procedures. The answers to the questions were found in the tradition of church teaching. Theology consisted of analyzing and explaining the meaning and the truth of what was already possessed in the tradition and deducing answers to questions that were being asked in the contemporary period from the material from the tradition. The form of theology was scholastic or neo-scholastic. This means that the theology of the schools was developed in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period, adopted the language of Aristotle, became the language of the discipline even into the 20th century. Philosophy and theology were considered comprehensive bodies of teaching which were to be resourced in order to understand the present period. A late 19th century encyclical, papal encyclical, declared that Thomas Aquinas should be considered the archetypal form of this theological language. In sum, Catholic theology, structurally now, the structure of the discipline, was didactic. It was based on authority. It used objective scholastic language, which teachers explained to students and researchers refined by commentary on past documents and resources. Second point of this period, the consciousness of history and change, historical change. Now, all people take account of time, but not till relatively recently have people become aware of cultural relativity. People in different times and different cultures understand things very differently. The Catholic Church became aware of the change of ideas through time very pointedly in the 19th century with John Henry Newman's essay on the development of doctrine. Newman showed that the essential doctrines of Christianity, they were called dogmas at the time, basically developed. But he also held that in their development, they could achieve a definitive and irreformable form. And so they have in the basic doctrines like Chalcedon and Nicaea. The question of historical change of meaning of basic doctrines was a major talking point in theology before the Second Vatican Council. The discussions, however, assumed and insisted upon three basic assumptions, or premises, we could say. First, the basic teachings of the Church were objectively true. They corresponded with reality. Second, they were universally true and relevant. In other words, they were not just truths for Catholics. In other words, the essential form was such that anyone could appreciate their truth cross-culturally. Third, there continues to be a development of doctrines. That's a basic premise, but the shifts and changes here do not go to the essential formulas of the basic truths. They remain constant, irreformable. In short, theology communicated a universally relevant truth, and the theologian's task was to explain and to communicate it to the faithful. For the most part, theology focused on the basic doctrines, the doctrines that are contained in the Creed. The third point, relationship of theology to the world. I noted earlier that theology consists of understanding the world from the perspective of Christian faith. This perspective includes the way the Church conceives itself relative to the world and how it conceives and regards the world outside itself in relationship to itself. So, for example, the theology of the Church and its mission thought of the world as mission territory. The mission of the Church was to convert the world to Christianity. Other religions were to be converted. Other Christians were to be converted, and society was there to be Christianized. The clearest place where theology related explicitly to the world was found in Catholic social teaching, which was preoccupied with questions about church and state, political economy, ownership of property, labor. After the first landmark social encyclical in the late 19th century, social ethics became a subject matter into itself, so a division between theology and ethics. The third marker in Catholic theology in the United States, in America, consists of a very broad front of different points you could point to, you could single out. One point consists of a fairly clear distinction on one side and the other between theology and ethics. They were considered distinct sub-disciplines. Another aspect of the relationship between theology and the world shows a strong distinction between the sphere inside the church, inside Christian faith, read Catholic faith, and looking out at a world of false faith, or a lack of faith, or of empty time, empty secularity. Much of this sensibility existed on the level of supposition and implication, as well as explicit teaching is too. But it also arose explicitly occasions, for example, in the question of whether or not there is salvation outside the church, a major question before the Second Vatican Council. So let me sum up here. The theology practiced in American Catholicism prior to Vatican II was objective, universally understandable in a technical sense, based on authority of the tradition of church teaching, and taught didactically. It consisted of stable, irreformable doctrines, taught by a universal magisterium or teaching authority that decided their meaning. They were meant to be internalized as such by everyone in the world. Salvation outside of this faith in these truths was at best iffy. Next period, 1966 to 1978. The effects of Vatican II. This second temporal division begins with the close of Vatican II in 1965, because upon its close, one begins to see the effects in the theological scholarship reflected, for example, in the plenary sessions and seminars and discussion groups at the Catholic Theological Society of America's meetings, and in the premier Catholic Journal of Theological Studies. The actual birth of Christian theology, the actual birth of American Catholic theology, happens in some newborn form during these 10 to 15 years. One of the witnesses, what one witnesses in the source data in this period were myriad new thoughts in every direction, really. One could call it a period of confusion or even chaos compared with what went before. But the metaphor of new green shoots springing up everywhere better likens it to a renewal of life. What follows then is an account reined in by these three ideas for making comparisons. But before I turn to the three points of comparison and defining this theology, let me first begin with a large impressionistic appreciation of what happened at the Second Vatican Council. The Council was perhaps the largest sustained discussion group in a single space in the history of the human race. It was an event, and it is a collection of documents. As an event, it had an uncommonly large non-Western representation, a life of 4 sessions over short of 4 years, 3.5 years, and a history of internal development that was covered by a worldwide press. It showed bishops disagreeing with each other and changing their minds. As a body of documents, it was not traditionalist, but appeals to scripture and modern experience. Its intent was to and is to be open to the world and to mark the official acceptance of the ecumenical movement, reversing a papal decision of 1928. The documents revolved around the church. It was mainly an ecclesial council about the church. But along the way, it treated many theological issues explicitly or implicitly. It became a new source and new focus for Catholic theology and greatly stimulated new initiatives. So let's move on now with our measuring stick. First, the nature of theology. Turning to the Catholic Theological Society of America, in 4 meetings from 1967 to 1970, the presidents addressed their fellow theologians about the nature of the discipline. They agreed that theology was changing and doctrines were being reformulated. The scholastic framework and language of theology had vanished. Theologians newly appealed to religious experience as a medium of God's Spirit, which was found in Protestant churches and in the secular world. Theology itself was beginning to find a new center of gravity in universities rather than in seminaries. It was interacting with other disciplines like psychology and sociology. Lay people, including women, were becoming theologians. A major topic during these years was the nature of theology, especially relative to the hierarchy, the nature of authority relative to theology, especially the authority of the hierarchy. Recall that when Paul VI proclaimed that the use of common means of birth control was morally wrong in 1968, many theologians and masses of ordinary Catholics believed that church authority was simply mistaken. Recall, too, that prior to Vatican II, accepting the teaching of authority was the very basis and the starting point of theology. Now authority itself became the subject matter of critical examination. Many argued that there were 2 distinct authorities in the church. One, the didactic and pastoral theology of the hierarchy, and the other, the critical technical authority of professional theology and its reflection on the tradition. The debate over theology meant that the deep structure, the very structure of Catholic theologians, how they went about doing their work, was changing under everyone's feet. The theologians were aware of it, and they sought a new stable footing. So the second point, consciousness of historical change. I turn now to the second marker of change, which is the actual experience, which was actually being experienced in the time of this reflection. This issue was part of the problem that was being engaged in the debate over authority. If history, by nature, necessarily changes with time, then authority ceases to consist in holding on to the past and must assume a new role of accepting change and acting as an arbiter of genuine or authentic new possibilities. A new appreciation of the implications of living in history was taking hold. History shows that each place in history is distinctive. Particular periods, discrete churches, cultures, discrete cultures and continents, for example, are significantly different from each other. The Second Vatican Council explicitly taught that different cultures should adapt church teaching to their distinctive situations. This mandate opened up the path for the quest for indigenous theologies around the world, from liberation theology in Latin America to the development of distinctive theologies in non-Western cultures. A good example of that is India, which is surrounded by Hinduism and Islam, a small church relative to India, but a sizable church in absolute numbers. The consciousness of change and new beginnings cannot be underestimated in the development of an American Catholic theology. Walter Burkhardt entitled his presidential address of 1968 with the following title, Towards an American Theology. The possibility rested on two suppositions. First, the first acknowledged that teachings of authority were always developing in history. They were not static. They were themselves, they moved along with history. And second, the second presupposition recognized that authoritative teaching, too, always comes under the influence of the time and place that it was formulated and it was being exercised. Theology was becoming an ongoing project, a project of interpretation and not a body of knowledge. The earlier problem of development of doctrine was turned upside down. The problem prior to the council, the problem in terms of Newman, was how theologians could understand that doctrines developed at all, since it was divine revelation. The new problem was asking this question in a different way. If doctrines are always developing because everything is in motion, because time itself is movement, then how can theology find what is stable and constant in the change? It looks like the same problem. It's an absolutely different problem. Third point, relation of Catholic theology to the world. One cannot easily quantify or determine exactly the massive shift that went on in attitudes towards the world that were signaled by the Second Vatican Council. One has to recall that the Church condemned certain features of modernity in the 19th century, among them democracy itself. And the Catholic Church in America developed systems of education, health care, and charity parallel to the public order that appeared overly Protestant. The Church had protected itself from the American world. By contrast, the final document of Vatican II on the Church in the modern world seemed to open up the Council with a message, seemed to sum up the Council with a message of openness to participation in this very world. The Council taught that there is salvation outside the Church, that theologians should read Protestant theology, not to refute it, but to learn from it. Of faith traditions outside Christianity, non-Christian religions, the Council declared, quote, the Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in these religions. So what is going on here? What's happening? I think it was formulated best by Brian Hare later, but with reference to this topic, this period, rather. Prior to the influence of Vatican II, theology was a distinct discipline that analyzed doctrines and was quite distinct from social ethics. Vatican II and reflection on its mandates stimulated the idea that the Church's active relationship to the world, to modern culture, and its problems was an integral part of the subject matter of theology. In fact, it gradually became a factor for judging the adequacy of theological understanding. What was the consequence of theological statements? Whose interest was being served by theological statements? So the relationship with the world is being written into the conclusions of theology as an inner criteria for their relevance. So let me sum up the new tendencies of American theology less than 15 years after the Second Vatican Council in the using the three comparative lenses that I'm operating with. From a discipline based on church authority, it was becoming a discipline based on corporate American faith experience that reflected critically on the church's authoritative teaching, traditional teaching, in order to make sense out of it, not to deny it, but to bring it forward and make sense out of it in the new word, today's actual world. It was forcefully conscious of temporal change and used the quest for contemporary relevance as a measure of the truth and vitality of theological teaching. American theology began to become self-consciously aware of the need to make theology applicable to national experience. So we move to the third period of our investigation. The elements of American Catholic theology. Central elements in the development of American Catholic theology were in place already when Pope John Paul II assumed office in October of 1978. But like a newborn deer on unsteady legs, it would grow sturdier and more differentiated in this final period. 45 years from then and now solidified shifts that had already begun and added an extraordinary range of diversity in subject matter that was subsumed under this discipline called theology. What happened during this period can be summarized as an intensification of the three descriptors. The nature of theology became diversified, pluralistic, and fragmented. The sense of time and history, historical contingency, deepened and raised basic questions about transcendent meaning, and the relationship with the world spawned a variety of liberation theologies. So the first point, the nature of theology. When theology migrated from the seminary to the university, it lost its catechetical character and became much more focused on the issues of personal and social life. The method or procedure of theology secured a foundational structure of entering into dialogue with the world and the life of the world around us. This correlation between theology and culture occurs in many different ways. It's not a mechanical process. The church authority can play a major or a lesser role in the dynamics of the classroom, for example, or the dynamics of authorship. But what is new and now established is that theology is pluralist. There is no single method. There is no single subject matter, and the content can vary considerably. I can enumerate or describe or communicate the pluralism of American theology easily by listing some of the major problems that presently occupy it and are occupied it in the literature during these 35 years. What follows are only large headings that are treated differently under each of these headings. But look at the major headings. They're so different from each other. First, liberation theologies have expanded, diversified, and focused theological imagination around various ingrained social and structural issues that affect human lives today, to suppress human freedom. Just look at them: economic poverty, race, gender, cultural identity, disability, and social marginalization. All of these summon forth a consuming theological passion to resist the problems, the suppression of freedom, and to transform the situation so that people can live full lives. So that's just one area of liberation theologies that have blown up, so to speak. Second, Christian theology generally, and Catholic theology in particular, are still trying to understand God and Jesus Christ in a way that is faithful to the tradition and yet not supremacist in relationship to other faith traditions. Third, Catholic theology has also become preoccupied with terracide, and it strives to formulate Christian self-understanding that corresponds with science and a growing popular sense of urgency in this sphere of ecological ruin. In this reflection, theology does not turn theology does not first turn to authority to learn what to say. Rather, the authority of the Church is largely following what the theologians are saying about these disciplines, these problems. Consciousness of historical change. Developments in theology since the Second Vatican Council have resulted in a new level of consciousness of time and historical change. Theology has continued to enter into dialogue with science in a conversation that is not well known because few have the expertise to engage it. But Catholic self-identity, many Catholic theologians identify as process theologians, process thinkers, because they have adopted a framework for thinking that accents that the world and reality itself is in perpetual motion. Time is not a container of entities, but an inner constituent of finite being. These insights have transformed for many the very nature of theological questioning. Time defines the meaning of what it means to be itself, our very being. What is the meaning of the speck of time occupied by a personal life? What is the brief moment occupied by the human species in our reality that makes it so important? These are new questions today, and people are not satisfied with the simple answers that trip off the tongue. Finally, the relationship of Catholic theology to the world. The relationship of American Catholic theology to the world, to the movement of society and culture, represents a very strong determinant of theology today. The many liberation theologies that occupy various groups of American theologians define the discipline as relating to the world. The very nature of the discipline is how Christianity relates to the world. The deepest problems it faces here have not been resolved with any consensus. For example, relating to other religions, as I just mentioned. After centuries of church-centered thinking, how do we think about other religions as religions under God's providence? The problem of how to understand Jesus Christ in the world today when there are so many religious mediators. America is a good place in which to engage this problem because our cities have become religiously pluralistic. this continues to be an area of development in American Catholic theology. So let me now conclude this, this discussion of the three characteristics of American Catholic theology today, of what has been spawned by the Second Vatican Council and by the turn towards culture to self-define this discipline. So I will express three kind of theses in line with the three descriptors that I use to develop each period. First, Catholic theology today is loyal to Catholic tradition, but it does not begin with or appeal to or depend on external authority as the source and foundation of its arguments. It begins with context. It begins with reflective analysis of our life in the world, and it critically appropriates the tradition to meet this situation. Second, consciousness of historical change. This consciousness of social change has made American Catholic theology a questioning and a searching discipline. It is constantly responding to new problems and seeking new dialogue partners in other disciplines. Consciousness of time, the fact that history provides many different contexts, which in turn deeply influence the way people think, has transformed Catholic theology into a discipline pursuing different theological interests, but always searching. It's not a body of knowledge, it's a continual search. Third, like America itself, Catholic theology has become pluralistic, as a diversity of practitioners address different problems with different methods of reflection. American theology is not monolithic and is, in fact, like the country itself, somewhat polarized. But it is gradually learning that the medium of exchange is not polemic, it's not debate, but it's conversation. And it remains in the Catholic tradition and appeals to it, Catholic tradition, as its home and audience, even though its sources and its audiences are more expansive than that. Now, one could reflect on a number of problems underlying Catholic theology today. In a way, the virtues of American Catholic theology are the sources of its problems. And everybody would have a different list of what those problems are. But I would single out an overarching concern that attaches to the whole discipline. And in a word, that is fragmentation. So diverse are the issues, the methods, the teachers, the writers of theology, and the courses that make up curricula and programs, that it becomes hard to define exactly what the boundaries of this discipline of Catholic theology is. What qualifies as a bona fide theological method with academic credentials? If American Catholic theology is to grow in academic stature, it will have to become more concerned with the structures, the sources, the method, and the point of entry into its subject matter than is apparent today in this sprawling academic discipline. Thank you. Thank you.
Roger, thank you for that magisterial presentation. Thank you for breaking it down so well into the three temporal phases, and then for each one, the identity of the theologian, the relationship with the world, etc. We have now time, if you have a question, to write your question on the index card and hold it up, and we have ushers here, and then we'll give Father Haight a few minutes to look through the questions. Maybe I can entertain you for a bit with that. It always struck me that there have been two councils, ecumenical councils in Rome, in the Vatican. The first one was in the 19th century, in the 1860s, and that was a polemical council. It was a council that defended the authority. The doctrine of papal infallibility came from that first Vatican Council. And I think it was a council that concentrated authority in Rome, in the papacy. And I think the documents really spoke about God the Father, God the most munificent God. And then, as Roger said, the Second Vatican Council was much more open to the world. It didn't have to be polemical. It was established in a way, and I think it concentrated more on Jesus Christ, the second person of the Blessed Trinity. And it decentralized authority. I don't know if Roger will agree. And it was really an episcopal, that is, giving authority to the bishops and groups of bishops, the bishops' conferences. And so my question would be, we need, don't we, a third Vatican Council that will concentrate on the laity and on the Holy Spirit as well. I don't know if you have had some time to look at this.
I think I can attack these.
Okay. Put these under here.
I think I'm just going to answer the easy ones here. Sure, thanks. Thank you. Well, here's one that's, I can answer them straightforwardly. I mean, I could go on, but I want to go through a few of them. Where is this? Yeah. As theology moves into the future, our lay people and theologians are made up of lay people and not priests and bishops. What's going to happen here? Is there any comment on this? And I would say yes, obviously. It seems to me from a lay point of view, lay people have a distinct perspective. They're immersed in the world in a much better way. They assume responsibility for responding to things that are part of everyday life in a much more tangible, concrete way. But if you take a big knife and you divide the big pie in big pieces, lay people are no more liberal or conservative than priests and bishops. I mean, the polarizing divides here is not, it seems to me, between clerics and lay people. It's simply not. That the divides really divide them in the same way. So, I mean, I'm not sure in the long run, as far as deep divisions are concerned, if it went in a polarized situation, it's not going to make much difference. But it will make a difference if the current development continues. If the current development continues, then something like 90% of theologians will be lay people. And for control of the ideation of a body to be in the hands of one group will certainly change it from what it was before the Second Vatican Council, when theology was a clerical discipline. So there's going to be some radical shifts here, but I don't think that you can chart them along the lines of openness and closedness, those big divides. But it will have an important effect on, and as I mentioned in the talk, when Francis wanted to write a letter on ecology, he didn't sit down and write it. He asked theologians to write it. So when those theologians will be lay people, there will be a different perspective on things than they are still. The ideology of the church is still in clerical hands, despite the makeup of theologians. So this is a very slow transition. Yeah, here's a question that I can't answer, so I'm not going to ask it. Just show my ignorance. Yes. Yes, here's a question about evolution. Given evolution, do you foresee American theology challenging original sin? Yes, I do see that as a possibility, and it's already in the literature already. A lot of theologians are calling that doctrine into question. It's not a question of sin, it's a question of the doctrine, and the doctrine is a very, very particular understanding of the way sin affects. So I don't think the doctrine of sin is going to go away, but the particular doctrine of original sin, which originated with Augustine and has dug its heels into Christian vocabulary, all Christian vocabulary, but decidedly in Catholic vocabulary, in the liturgy, in prayer, and so on. That doctrine will shift. It cannot withstand the evolutionary framework. Now, I'm talking about the doctrine. It's impossible. The doctrine, the way it's formulated today, is impossible. So it has to sort of, this happens over a period of time, you know, but theologians have already challenged it. How does theology remain the same? There are many ways of answering that question. But I would say that the most commonsensical and basic way is to say that it lives in the body of the faithful. The doctrines emerged out of the body of the faithful through worship. They're the implication of religious experience of God mediated through Jesus Christ. And that is a lived experience. It's not a notional experience. It's in our behavior. It's in our worship. It's in our language. It's in our discernment of where we go. If we take our faith seriously, we consult the roots of our deepest faith. So it's in the practice of the church and in the assembly that doctrines are preserved. So the development of doctrine and tradition, there's a definition or a theological understanding of tradition that its locus is not on pieces of paper with formulae and so on. It's a living thing that lives in the company of the people as they move through history. And that's where faith remains the same. All Christians, Catholics, Protestants, all Christians can say they look to God through the mediation of Jesus, and they find the face of God in Jesus' life and ministry, and that's how they relate to ultimate reality, God. So that is something that's ingrained in people's consciousness and practice and so on. That's where doctrine remains the same. What are the three major fragmenting issues today? Oh, there could be a long list there, because you'd have to sort of distinguish. Well, first of all, we're in a very polemical period, so everything's up for grabs. There's nothing that you can say that somebody doesn't say, I agree, and others will say they disagree. So the church is almost the mimic of our political situation today. There's very, very close parallels between not the same persons, because people can be conservative politically and liberal religiously, but the same polarization is going on inside the church and outside the Catholic Church in the political framework. So, so what are those issues? They could be many issues and so on. So I would tend to think in terms of theology, in terms of the discipline of theology. And this is where a layperson would say, oh, you're just thinking your thoughts. Go ahead and think your thoughts. But what's really going on are basic issues in Christian life and discernment and how to make decisions and plan families and work. So ethical issues are the main things in everyday life. But for a theologian, some of the major problems are, and one that's going to remain with us, is the relationship of Jesus Christ as the exclusive mediator of salvation, or the constituent mediator of salvation. In other words, a Christocentric worldview versus a theocentric worldview. A theocentric worldview thinks of the world, of God and Creator, who is the God creator of all people. And all people plug into Jesus through different mediators. And for Christians, Christ is the mediator. And for some Christians, Christ is the mediator for all human beings, and for other Christians, theologians, Christ is the mediator for Christians and for anybody else who wants to be, but there are other bona fide mediators for other religions that are not sort of canceled by Jesus Christ, or even I kept referring to this as a supremacist situation. Jesus Christ is not the supreme mediator, but one of several mediators who are all God's mediators. That is a major bone of contention among theology today. Probably the major problem of theology today. Top three. I don't know what would be second to that problem in terms of, there are theology has taken an ecological turn very, very strongly, but it seems to me that that's ethical in character, although it does involve creation theology and so on. So it has strictly theological, narrowly theological implications. I have some other problems with certain theologies and so on. I think another question of theology is the degree with which one begins one's theological interpretation with authority or with experience. Now, it seems to me that no one who begins with experience leaves authority behind if they're operating as a Christian. Christianity and its tradition has an authoritative place in that person's psyche and so on. And a person who is doing theology from the point of view of being starting with Scripture or starting with the authority of the magisterium and so on, and applying that, still is asking questions that are being generated from the life in our world today, experience. So it's not that there's an antithesis between these two approaches, because both includes the other, but there is a weight and a language and a way of doing theology that is a clear dividing line between some theologian and other theologians, and that is a fragmenting one, because people don't tend to take the other group seriously. So it's almost a human problem, but it's a fragmenting problem. So those are at least two that are vital today in the academic theological community today. I mean, there are other dividing points. I mean, it seems to me that a lot of theology, I find the canopy of courses that are being offered in theology is almost intrinsically popularization rather than hard thinking about the meaning of the Christian doctrines and how they have to be interpreted anew in our world today. I mean, people aren't streaming out of the churches today because for no reason at all. It's because Christianity and Christian faith, Catholic faith, is not moving them. It's not touching them. So it seems to me that a facile use of Christian language is both attractive to people who are in that world and so on, but there are a whole world of people out there that just cannot abide this traditionalist language, and it's pushing them out the door. So there's another fragmenting polarity in theology that is reflected in curricula and reflected in theological literature, where things are serious and engaging and deep, and others are simply skimming the surface of theological language and not going to the problems that are intrinsic to the language itself. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's too long a question for me to answer. No, I won't go there. Yes, here's a good question. I may have answered this already. Yes, yeah. This is a good question, and I don't know. You'll all have to formulate your own answers to this question. Will the plurality and diversity of Catholic theology or any theology alienate people who are looking for straightforward answers to their questions? Now, that's a very good question. And I think the answer to it is yes. The diversity of theology is troubling for many people, and it will disturb them. And they will do look for simple answers, and simple answers is what they want. And then some simple answers, if somebody can give it to them, is what will satisfy them. So I think the implied answer to the question is yes, it will disturb a lot of people. But there are another whole group of people who will not be satisfied with just any answer, because if it's simple and straightforward, that's what it's going to be, simple and straightforward, and it's not going to have the complexity of the problems that face a theologian or any Catholic who wants to be loyal to the tradition and think thoughts that are current and in our actual world. So I think you can divide the answer to this question between yeses and nos, because a lot of people will be turned off by superficial answers that are so direct and so simple that they'll be turned away. I mean, I can start telling you stories about cases where people simply cannot accept basic truths that they've always lived with for years. And now they're attacked by a contemporary culture, and they cannot find the answer to it. And so they look for other people, and they're looking for the theological literature or anybody answering the question of what the immensity of our universe says about us as a species and calls it and its purpose into question. So I alluded to that in my address. That is a very, very deep question, and it cannot be answered with a simple, straightforward answer. Or, if a person is going to accept a simple, straightforward answer, it's because that's what that person needs, and fine, that's the answer. But if somebody is really disturbed, it's going to take a little bit more deep discussion in order to get there. I mean, I don't know if that's an answer to the question is. It's a yes and a no, but it seems to me to be that's where we are. I don't understand this question, so I'll ask it and give it two answers because I don't know which is the question. Is Catholic social teaching a sufficient lens for Catholic conversation with ecumenical and interfaith and humanist perspectives on American social issues, race and gender orientations and so on today? I think, again, for some people, Catholic social teaching is where the rubber meets the road, and therefore it is something that people from different faiths can engage. What should be done about racism in the United States? Everybody is now beginning to face up to the fact that we are a racist culture and a racist society. Okay, so now what do we do about it? How do we address it, and so on? So everybody seems to me, can talk about that issue, and it's where interfaith dialogue can sort of meet on an existential level where we can address the common issues together as an American society from our faith perspectives, and therefore pool them in order to address the question that we're in. So that's true. And I mean, I don't think that that's the end of the story. In other words, to enter into inter-religious dialogue beyond social issues and so on, and doing comparative theology and comparing theologians, comparing theology and worldviews and conceptions of reality, that too has its place. And the reason is not to convert the other, but in order to learn things from other traditions. Now, I'm not a deeply interreligious theologian, but I do sort of have a team taught with a Hindu scholar and with Buddhist scholars and so on. And I have learned from reading other traditions, and they have had an effect on how my Christian vocabulary takes on deeper meaning, and so on. So interreligious dialogue, face to face, on religious issues and not just social issues, does have a place, it seems to me, and an important place. That's just one of the developments in theology. Comparative theology, doing theology in dialogue with other faith traditions, has become a bona fide discipline within the Catholic curricula of theology departments in the United States. So it's an authentic theological discipline. It had to fight to get there, but it is there now. So with that, I think we can conclude. Thank you very much for your attention. It's been fun speaking with you.
That was stimulating, interesting, and clear, mostly clear. Of course, the argument from authority is the weakest argument, says Aristotle, says St. Augustine. Sorry. I'd like to just remind everyone those here present and those via live stream that next month, a month from today, March 28th, we will have the third in our lecture series. It will be given by Father James Martin, who lives in the same community as Father Haight. I'd also like to acknowledge Mr. Felipe Proper, who is our parishioner sitting in the front row, who has underwritten this lecture series. We're very grateful, Felipe. For all of us gathered here, we are welcome for a reception down in Wallace Hall. And as Father Haight began this evening with a prayer for Ukraine and Russia, let us say a prayer as well to conclude. As we journey through this Ignatian year, may we be shown the path to you, God of all people, and live out our vocation, becoming the person you have invited us to be. Give us the grace to work for reconciliation every day, with you, with others, and with your creation. Open our eyes so we might see all things new in Christ. Amen. Amen. Good night and thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah, we did it. You said it couldn't be done. Yeah, good. Let me
There are a lot of questions, huh?